Hey everyone, it's Em. So I know you've all been enjoying the vampire content, and we're coming up on the finale, so I'll have like a video about that soon, and I'll also talk more about the books as I reread them. But in the meantime, I had this. So recently I went on these very long plane rides and had time to ruminate while also having earplugs in to try and not hear the little girl's iPad behind me because her parents can't invest in headphones, or the guy snoring really loudly, pretty sure he has like sleep apnea, over across the aisle. Anyway, while wandering my own brain, I was thinking about Stranger Things because it's one of my favorite shows, and also I've been working on a fic that hopefully I'll finish at some point and post. But in the meantime, I was thinking more specifically about how Stranger Things is really about dads and father figures. And I thought, you know what? I'll make a video about it. So here's Crowley. So for those of you who haven't watched Stranger Things, you've heard of it, you haven't seen it somehow, I'll give you a quick recap. Although, I don't know why you'd watch this video, except maybe out of curiosity. Stranger Things is a Netflix series that's had 4 seasons, is coming up on a 5th and final season that should air in 2024 or 25. It centers largely around a small Indiana town called Hawkins, and is the first season is set in 1983, and it goes through 1986. The main characters are middle schoolers, and in the last season, freshmen in high school. And it's a love letter to the 80s and to 80s films, television, pop culture, the Stephen King aesthetic. It is largely a horror sci-fi show. And as the series has gone on, the cast has slowly expanded to include a lot of minor characters that are just as well developed as the main characters. And therefore, people generally fall in love with a lot of the different characters on the show. There. That's the recap. But here's the thing. The more I think about it, the more I realize that the show is largely about masculinity and different forms of masculinity and dads and father figures. And so I thought we would just go through some of the dads and father figures on the show and explore them a little bit. I don't know how, I made notes, but I may ramble a bit. You can bear with me or not, it's up to you. I also have this cat now, who may, yeah. Anyway, we're going to start with the father figures for the main 4 male characters that we're introduced to in the very first episode of the very first season. Mike Wheeler, Lucas Sinclair, Dustin Henderson, and Will Byers. The first season centers around the fact that Will Byers goes missing after leaving Mike's house one night after a Dungeons and Dragons game, and the search for Will is the focus of the season. Meanwhile, also there is a character named L11, but they call her L, who has escaped from a local laboratory where she's been experimented on her entire life, and there are government agents looking for her at the same time that Will's friends are looking for him. Excitement ensues. So we're going to start with Mike Wheeler, his father Ted. Mike has a pretty average life. He has an older sister, Nancy. He lives with his mom, dad, and sister. There's not a broken home here. His dad is the quintessential 80s dad. If you think about the 80s, if you're old enough to remember the 80s, you remember that parenting was done largely by, at the best, benign neglect, at the worst, actual neglect or indifference. If you're a Gen Xer like me, you remember that your parents were kind of not that interested in anything you were doing, and they kind of let you run loose. People will say it was a simpler time, and that's kind of what Stranger Things predicates itself on, which is why Will's disappearance is such a big deal. Obviously, it's a big deal anytime a child goes missing, but in a small town that's considered safe, and in the 80s, they heighten it a bit. Ted Wheeler he works and then he comes home, and he largely leaves the house issues to his wife. He's not that interested in his kids, except when they're annoying. He's pretty clueless as to anything that's going on with them. He's not aware of his daughter's love interests and things. He finds Mike's friends annoying because they tend to congregate at his house and eat his food. Things like that. He is ineffectual, but also largely harmless. He doesn't have a huge impact on the world around him. He's just kind of floating through it. He has a lot of faith in the law enforcement and, the rules, and he's going to let the police take care of it. He doesn't really know how to engage with his children, as his son, Mike, is so distraught over Will's disappearance. Ted is a little bit tactless. He doesn't mean to be. He's not trying to be mean. He just does not know how to show that kind of emotion. So that's Ted Wheeler. And then we don't see a lot of Lucas's family. We see a lot of his sister Erica in later seasons, but Lucas also lives with a younger sister, Erica, and his two parents. And Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair aren't seen a lot. What we do see is that Mr. Sinclair tends to defer to his wife for the sake of keeping the peace, at least at home, it seems like. The Sinclair women are both very strong personalities. Definitely Erica is, and what we see of Mrs. Sinclair, she also is. And this plays out a little bit when Lucas starts a relationship with another strong personality, a girl named Max, where, for the sake of keeping the peace, almost willing to just kind of capitulate. It doesn't mean that Lucas doesn't have strong opinions, and he will voice them, particularly if it's just him and his guy friends. He's a little more hesitant to cross his girlfriend, but he's willing to speak up to guy friends. He spends a lot of time trying to figure out where he fits in the hierarchy when he joins things like the high school basketball team. And I don't know if that's because Lucas is the person of color in this group, and he's, having to tread carefully on what he can and can't say or get away with without it coming across wrong. I can't speak to that, obviously, that experience. But what we see of Mr. Sinclair seems to model for Lucas a certain kind of masculinity in which there are times to speak up and times not to. There are times to take charge and times to stand back and, let somebody else do. So then we get to Will Byers. Now, Will has an older brother, Jonathan, who's in high school, and they live with their single mom, Joyce. So the father figure, we see Lonnie, who lives in another town. We see him only after Will has disappeared. We don't really see him interact with Will at all. Lonnie is clearly opportunistic and self-centered, and we see flashbacks in which we can hear Joyce and Lonnie arguing, but it seems that Jonathan is largely Will's male role model. Jonathan, who tried to shield Will from the fighting by sharing musical tastes with him. But Will have other father figures in later seasons, like Bob, who Joyce dates for a while, who's a compassionate, sweet guy who does his best to try and help Will through some of the trauma that he's having to deal with once he's discovered and comes back from what's known as the Upside Down. The Upside Down is Hawkins, only terrible Hawkins, but populated by evil creatures. So I'm getting off topic here, but so what we have is like Joyce has brought Will and Jonathan back to her hometown to raise them in the small town feel after they've had like a divorce. But they've been there a long time because Will has been Mike's friend since like kindergarten. So this is home. He's kind of not entirely missing hang on. He's known Mike since kindergarten, but we know that the fighting, so I guess Lonnie lived in Hawkins with them and then Lonnie left. I'm just now figuring this out because I'm just now thinking about it. But anyway, in any case, he's grown up in Hawkins with his friends. His father is gone, but it sounds like his father wasn't much of a father figure anyway. His mother is doing her best to hold it together as a single mom and still find satisfying relationships. She will eventually start a relationship with the sheriff of the town, Jim Hopper, and we'll talk about him more in a minute. But then there's Dustin Henderson, who also comes from a fatherless household. We were not told anything about Dustin's dad. He's never brought up. He's not mentioned really. He doesn't seem any like the worse for just being raised by his mom. In fact, he and his mom have a really great relationship, like a sweet relationship. And we'll talk about other role models that Dustin has a little later too, because Dustin's role models are more of a big deal to fans than a lot of these other dad figures. Okay, let's talk about Eleven's dads, of which there are 3 of a sort. So 11 is, like I said, a girl who has been raised in a laboratory facility with other kids like her. They have special powers that are being, that are the source of experimentation by the government. The lab is run by a Dr. Brenner, who all of the children in the lab call Papa. Pretty on the nose. Papa is there to test their abilities and their limits. And so he is the tiger dad, if there is such a thing. He's the coach. He's going to shout at them, try to get them to their limits. He doesn't really shout a lot, but he is not above putting the screws to the kids to get the results he's seeking. He's not above pushing them in ways. I mean, he tries to, I don't want to say he tries to be compassionate. He tries to come across as compassionate, but his actual compassion is pretty nil. Papa is the one that all of the kids in the lab will seek the approval of, because he is so hard to please. And so he's that kind of father figure. Now, in conjunction with Dr. Brenner, there's Dr. Owens, played by Paul Reiser, and he is the good cop to Dr. Brenner's bad cop. He is compassionate. He is the one who insists that they let kids rest when they need rest. He is the one who later on will help Elle hide from the world once she's out in the world. He'll, get her a fake birth certificate and things like that. And then finally, there's Jim Hopper, or Hop as he's sometimes called. So he's the Hawkins sheriff who eventually adopts Elle. He's the one that Dr. Owens gets the certificate for, so that it can seem like Elle is legitimately Jim's daughter. And he is the macho dad. The whole second season really is about Jim trying to dad, and Elle's natural resistance to being told what to do or having to follow rules, particularly after being locked up in a facility for so long, yearning for freedom, wanting to be with her newfound friends, Mike and the others. Her relationship with Mike being, complicated by, Jim trying to regulate that relationship. And is Jim a toxic character? Well, sometimes. There for a while, yeah, he really was. But part of the story is the arc that shows Jim figuring things out and getting better as he goes. The proof that not all dads are great all the time, but often they are working out of the desire to do the right thing, be a good dad, working from a place of love and good intent, even though it isn't always doesn't always come across that way, and often the results are less than desirable. So, Elle's 3 dads, and then she goes, and when you consider that Jim and Joyce are kind of in a relationship now, Elle kind of has adopted brothers, Will and Jonathan. It gets weird blended family stuff going on, but there are other dads that we see. We see, for example, Billy Hargrave's dad, is that his name? Yeah. Who is verbally abusive and somewhat physically abusive, if I'm remembering right, which predisposes Billy towards being abusive as well to his stepsister Maxine. He can't take his anger out on his dad, so it devolves onto the other people around him, which is a show of how toxic masculinity can become something that spreads. We see in flashbacks that Billy was really close to his mom. He's dealing with the fact that his mom didn't really stay or want to, stay with him, and that he's stuck with a dad that doesn't maybe actually love him, or at least not in a way that is healthy. So we're dealing with toxic masculinity on that scale. And then when you think about Victor Creel in the most recent season, he's a dad who has a son, Henry, who has exhibited some of these powers like Elle and the other kids. And Victor tries to he doesn't enable. He either is trying to pretend it's not happening, or at the best trying to kind of obscure it, like maybe it's not a big deal. And again, if you think of Ted Wheeler as somebody who just kind of is clueless, Victor's not clueless, but he wants to be. The ignorance is bliss kind of theme there is pretty key until something comes around and bites you in the ass and you can no longer ignore or avoid it. The stick your head in the sand kind of sense of these men, these family men who are like, if I just ignore it, it'll go away and it'll all be fine in the end. And that's proven time and again not to be true. The whole point is that you've got to deal with issues, nip them in the bud, as it were, or somehow tackle them rather than ignore them. Okay. Is that Is that everybody? All right. Well, and I mean, there's Mr. Clark, who is the AV teacher, and this kind of goes towards towards Dustin too, because Mr. Clark is a role model to Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will, but Dustin especially seems to have that connection with him because Dustin is our science-y, logic-y, goes to like a science camp every summer, that kind of thing. He's like ultimate nerdy. Like if Will is D&D nerdy and artsy nerdy, Dustin is the science-y nerdy type. And then, okay, well, let's start with Steve. So Steve Harrington, Nancy's boyfriend for part of season 1. So we don't meet Steve's dad, but we are introduced to him as like an influence when Steve's friend Tommy mentions that, yeah, it's a good thing Steve's dad went on the business trip Steve's mom went on the business trip with his dad because his dad's a player, and Steve is seen as this kind of playboy type person. His dad has money, apparently runs his own company or something, and Steve is like the king. He's going to inherit the crown. And he's got a lot to live up to with this idea of this dad who's wealthy and desirable. Steve plays that game for a while, then over the course of 4 seasons realizes it's not who he wants to be. He's a kind of a one-girl guy. He really loves Nancy. He starts to develop like relationships with people that matter, and he starts to make real connections with people, as opposed to the superficiality of the 80s like go-getter that he was kind of expected to be. So it's a really nice arc for this character, and it's really nice character development. He loses Nancy to Jonathan, but he forms, solid friendships with Dustin and a character named Robin, and over time, other characters as well. But for many fans of the show, his relationship with Dustin in particular, Steve becomes known as the babysitter because he ends up somehow always taking care of these kids while everybody else is off doing other stuff. And he gets frustrated with it, obviously. The jokes and the memes are Steve as the single mom of all these kids, but he's suited to it, and he has a genuine desire to protect and help and be useful, and it's sweet. And he pays for it by his dad not giving him a job in the company, the family business right away. He has to go work at an ice cream shop. He works at a video store. He's kind of feeling out his way because he, I guess, didn't get into college or and so is he a role model of sorts? He does tell Dustin how to fix his hair and what to do to get girls to like him. Steve's advice isn't always on point, but it comes from a good place. I think it goes to show that not all advice is right for all people. Your mileage may vary, as they say, depending on who you are, and being true to yourself is really the core of Steve's story here, where instead of being what everybody expected or wanted him to be, he eventually embraced his genuine self to his detriment in a lot of ways, losing out on girls and, losing a little bit of his confidence, but he loses a lot of his swagger, but he becomes a more endearing character over time. Now, whether that helps him in life or just helps viewers like him more. The other character that plays a big part in Dustin's life as a male role model in the 4th season is, of course, Eddie Munson, who runs the D&D club at the high school. He's a perpetual student because he has failed to graduate, so I think he's pushing 20 but still a senior. And he is the, kind of the fun-loving, I don't care what other people think about me guy that makes it, once again, okay to be yourself, whether... So, I mean, when you think that Dustin's got, Steve there and Eddie there, he's getting basically repeated messages of, you got this, but also we're your safety net. We're here for you too. And so Dustin ends up not feeling the loss of male role models the way he might have absent a father. Now, we don't know what it was like for him when he was younger, but he ends up having and finding and having healthy relationships with other guys, his friends, older guys, and it ends up being really, sweet and, like I said, for a lot of viewers, very meaningful to watch. We hear about Eddie Munson's father, again, kind of like with Steve, we only hear about him in passing. He's in jail. He taught Eddie to hotwire cars as a kid. He's Eddie doesn't want to be like his dad. Eddie's kind of afraid of ending up like his dad. He and Steve kind of have that in common, where he's like, I always swore I wouldn't end up like my old man, but here I am, stealing a car and wanted for murder. So I guess you can't escape your genetics. So the desire to do better and be better is there. The desire to evolve past the toxic masculinity is there. There's kind of a very hopeful slant to Steve and Eddie's stories. If you've seen the show, you know that Eddie doesn't survive, but he also has his Uncle Wayne, who cares for him a lot. His Uncle Wayne, who believes that Eddie is a good kid, even if most people see him, he is the local drug dealer, but he's entrepreneurial, maybe, I don't know. It's the heart of gold kind of thing. Both Steve and Eddie have that, and that's kind of a nice take. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us on the spectrum? We've got dads who are too hard and dads who are compassionate and sweet, and we've got kids who don't want to be like their dads for various reasons, because their dads are not admirable. What the Stranger Things overall gives us is this spectrum of masculinity in which a lot is reflected and deflected, and it's almost like a series of mirrors that you could beam different information piece to piece. And like I said, this is just a reflection that I had literally while stuck on an airplane. I don't have a cool summary. It's just something that I've thought about a lot in the meantime, because it kind of stuck with me, that the show is largely about forms of masculinity, what we do with that, the women in it's 11 is a main character, but it's her. The story is about the female impact on the male collective, in the sense that Elle shows up and it kind of reverberates through the friend group, and then Max shows up and that reverberates through the friend group. It's the show takes a stab at female friendships with Elle and Max, but it does not delve nearly as deeply into those things. And you see the women, the moms, But again, it doesn't delve into the female side so much as show the impact of female on the male, right? Because it is at its heart a male story. And like, I don't know if the writers just aren't confident telling, like, you know, the Duffer brothers are brothers, they're guys, they're doing a guy thing. Yeah, is that, yeah, I mean, even with like Steve, who, like, he's impacted by Nancy and Robin, and we see those relationships develop, but the relationship between Nancy and Robin as two female characters, we see them act together and they have some little dialogues together, but most of those dialogues are about Steve or John, you know, they're about their relationships with the guys around them. Max and Elle go shopping, but like, again, it's more like, let's be us and not worry about the guys because guys suck, but it's still kind of centered around the guys. And then the guys, when they argue, it's usually because girls. They argue also, though, about what actions to take whenever trouble arises, because that tends to fall to the guys. Elle is a character who has a lot of power, but the guys tend to argue about whether or not to use that power. Like, Elle spends a lot of her time, you know, trying to prove she's independent and can make her own choices in the matter, whereas, you know, there are guys going, we should use her. No, we don't want to tire her out, you know, and she's like, I'm right here. So it is, at its heart, a masculine story. It does explore a lot of different forms of masculinity, ways to be masculine in the world in the 80s. But also now, obviously, you can carry a lot of this forward. And it's interesting on that level. To me, as a media studies person, I find it interesting. When I explained some of this to my 13-year-old son, he found it very interesting. Sorry, my screensaver came on because I've been talking too long. But my 13-year-old son found it very interesting to have to think about. He didn't have to think about it, but like to think about when I pointed out some of this to him, because it wasn't something that as a 13-year-old would have occurred to him very much. But I think it's worth thinking about and looking at and examining from that point of view, just for fun, even just as a point of entertainment, which is how I'm doing it. Like, I make no judgment on it. It just, this is what I noticed, and I find it interesting. So let me know what you think. If you've watched Stranger Things, if you enjoy the masculine relationships, who you think is toxic in what ways. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you, and we'll have more vampire content after the next, I think the next episode is the finale for the season, I think. So, take care.